Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar, Supporting Families to Navigate Tough Times, the Impact of Financial and Housing Insecurity, Isolation and Discrimination. My name is Lydia Trouse and I'm the Child and Family Partnership Advisor at Emerging Minds. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge country. We recognise the land on which we meet today and pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their ancestors, their elders, past, present and emerging from the different First Nations across this country. We acknowledge the importance of connection to land, culture, spirituality, ancestry, family and community for the well-being of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. Before we dive into our discussion today, I've got a little housekeeping to cover. We'll have a live Q&A at the end, so you can put your questions via the questions box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. And this webinar will be recorded and will be available in about 2 weeks' time via the aifs newsletter or the aifs website under the webinar banner. There's a few related readings and resources. They'll be in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And there are also closed captions available for this webinar, and the link for those is in the chat box. And there'll be a short feedback survey, which will open at the end of the webinar. Before we begin, we'd like to recognise the children, young people and adults within families and diverse communities with many and varied lived experiences who've come before us. We appreciate the experiences of people whose pain, trauma and heartache, including harmful systemic practices, require recognition and compassion. We recognise the strengths and know-how that children and families have drawn on to navigate difficult times, and we respect the skills people have developed to contribute their lived experience. We are committed to deeply listening and responding with integrity to their voices and expertise. I'd also like just to mention missing voices. So we hope that the resources we share today will have something to offer all families, but we recognise they're simply a snapshot of the lived experiences of the families who created them. Other families will have different experiences and stories to share. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices are not reflected in these resources, as we intentionally create resources with and for community that reflect cultural ways of knowing, being and doing. So it's important to note that all the themes we're talking about today disproportionately affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And while addressing this was outside the scope of this project, it's something that we've carried in our hearts and it remains critical and will be a future piece of work at Emerging Minds. Our approach will be to co-create these resources with and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. And if you want to read a bit more about our approaches for that, you can check that out on the Emerging Minds website. So I'm going to introduce our presenters now. It's my pleasure to welcome Kerry Hawkins, Zan Mader and Emmy. So Kerry, could you please share who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. I should also just say I'm on the unceded Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation here today for this webinar. So I'm an Emerging Minds board member. I have been for quite some years now. The reason I'm a board member is I originally came to Emerging Minds looking for help as a family member, actually looking for practical, real help that I wasn't finding anywhere else in the system. And I'm engaged with Lydia, who invited me to come on to provide advice from a family perspective on all of the work that Emerging Minds does.
Thanks, Kerry. And you, Zan?
Hi everyone, my name is Zan. I use they, them pronouns and I'm on Kaurna land. I am a narrative therapist in alternative practice at the moment and have been very lucky to be involved in this project. I should say I'm also a parent of a small human and yeah, we'll find out more.
Thank you, Zan. And Emmy?
Yeah, hi, I'm Emmy. I also use they, them pronouns and I'm coming from the Kaurna lands. And I'm here to provide a lived experience perspective and as a parent who's lived through different forms of distress and hardship and has come out the other side.
Thanks, Emmy. It's been a huge honour to work with these three people here today. So I really hope that everyone here joining gets just a snippet of what I've been able to learn from these three people. It's really amazing. So Kerry, I thought maybe we could begin with you. This whole project actually started because you were persistent in reminding me about the devastating impact of poverty on families and children. Would you be able to say a bit about this and what it was like for you trying to get support for your family at that time?
So the context for our family was catastrophic mental health crises over many, many years. That significantly impacted emotionally and practically on our family, including our children. But probably the worst thing of all, apart from a mental health system that didn't work, was the lack of supports and the lack of money. So at a time when you most need resources, human resources, financial resources to deal with a crisis, and I had to give up work to keep my loved one alive when the system failed. So you find yourself in shock, probably. So we went from sort of two middle class incomes down to nothing, to absolutely nothing. And the shock of the inability of the system to respond to that, what that was our reality, blew me away. I'm educated, white, middle class person with a sense of agency, went looking, looked under every corner, went to every agency, asked everybody I could for help. Nobody addressed it. And probably from our perspective, in some ways even worse, the kind of help we got was not helpful. I'd be going asking for real practical support to address our lack of income in a world where you need income to survive. And would instead find that I'd have, so many people employed to do things, and I'd really much rather have had the money that they were being paid, frankly. So it was like a double whammy of having no income, feeling abandoned, feeling betrayed by the world, and looking for help everywhere, and just not getting it, getting lots of sympathy, getting lots of, oh my gosh, this is a postcode lottery. If you live somewhere else, maybe you might get a $50 voucher for something. And that's compounded with all of we use sanitized language now, but the horrible feelings of shame and humiliation of trying to survive in a community where everyone else kind of assumes that you have money and you simply don't. It is such a foundational, toxic, compounding experience on top of already really, really distressing crises that you're trying to hold. So it was just this compounding experience of circumstances and emotions that are paralyzing, isolating. It fills you with physical dread. There's physical pain inside you all of the time. And then, you have people telling, if you go to a counsellor for support, they would just say, oh, well, you've just got to kind of manage your emotions and use CBT to kind of quarantine yourself from this existential threat that you're surrounded by all day, every day, or going to, financial counsellors who tell us that it's actually the lack of our budgeting skills, for example. When you've got no income to manage and then being told you have to manage an income is incredibly offensive and insulting, and would just add to that kind of emotional load. My memories of that time, or those times, was just, like we'd gone from a family where we had a share portfolio and then being told, oh, you don't know how to manage money, this is your fault. And so every experience came back onto us. And it was stigmatizing, it was paralyzing, it nearly destroyed us. The impact it had on my parenting, of course, was huge. And I did it alone, and no one ever should do that alone, and either be kind of not blamed. I think there was an implication of blame there from friends, families, service providers, or just simply invisible, whether it's the mental health system, whether it's the so-called support systems for 99.9% of your existence, you're invisible. So there's so much exhaustion and terror that come from these experiences. And so just kind of whenever I go to a service or, look for help, that just kind of blew me away. And so with Emerging Minds, at least, I had a sense that maybe at least if we could do something to address and amplify the lived experience of these circumstances, maybe somehow we can get some structural reform happening. Yeah.
Thanks, Kerry, for sharing all of that detail. I think, you said better than anyone about the huge impacts for your family and children. Could you talk a bit about why it matters that practitioners are able to explore the ways that families and children are always responding to these impacts?
I mean, I think this is the one point where it matters, because how practitioners approach this is so important, and can make all the difference if at least there's no more harm being done. So not being blamed, understanding and supporting how families can get through this without internalizing the blame and the shame. Emmy said that families can come through this, and we did come through it, but we mostly came through it because I was kind of able to work through all of these issues and connect with other families who I suddenly realised it wasn't us, it wasn't our fault actually, and we weren't an anomaly. This is kind of a common experience. And so that gave me a little bit more courage to keep pushing and to keep working through rather than giving up and, living in despair. And so the way that people interact with us, at least not seeing us as walking deficits, at least giving us strength and praise to keep moving. I was hoping eventually we could get to the point where people have some structural competency around these things to actually help provide us with some proper structural supports as well, so we don't have to keep doing all of that work around the help seeking. I remember once we had a Centrelink worker in the hospital system, a social worker who was looking at helping us with Centrelink, and they gave up. They came back and said, "This is too hard. I'm sorry, here's a number, see what you can do." And so always the load of help seeking, of service navigation, such that it was, comes back onto families. And I was having to hold all of our families' needs, and at least having someone to help share some of that load would have been amazing. It would have made a lot of difference for us.
Yeah, awesome. That's really important advice. Thank you, Kerry. And did you want to mention quickly why the title of this webinar feels like a bit of an oversimplification for you?
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. So that was my first response when I saw the title for this webinar. I don't know if it flagged anything with other people, but for me, and I'm not even sure that oversimplification is the response I had. It was a response of, my gosh, this is such a sanitized, distanced, almost Orwellian description of our experiences. So our experiences were of violence, of betrayal, of abandonment by the system. You can talk about housing insecurity when you live that, when you have people threaten to take away your house, when you have to navigate with banks and other service systems that blame you, when you're living with a knot of fear in your stomach because you're not quite sure how you're going to provide that $5 for a school excursion, when you actually are faced with not living in the house that you thought you were able to provide for your children. All of those experiences do not resonate with the language, the sanitized, hygienized language of insecurity. I just wonder whether it is actually masking and maybe providing a bit of cover for actual structural action that needs to happen in this space.
Thank you, Kerry, for raising that. And it's, as we worked through this and Zan came on board, we started referring to it as structural oppression, and I've started to hear people also use structural violence as terminology as well, which is probably more fitting with people's lived experiences. Thanks, Kerry. I'm going to talk quickly about the approach that we took coordinating this project. So we took a co-production approach, and when I was the staff member at Emerging Minds, sort of coordinating it. So the way that I set it up was with 2 lived experience mentors, and Kerry was one mentor, and we had another person, Louise, who they mentored me in doing this project, and they had a huge variety of roles and different ways that they supported me in frameworks and understandings, and trying to set up accountable and safe enough spaces for lived experience co-design work to happen. And then I also worked with 4 sort of main co-designers, and Emmy was one of those with lived experience, and there were 3 other people as well, and that was made the core working group that we worked with together. And then of course throughout the project we heard from lots of other lived experience voices as well, but we had this core group of 4 lived experience co-designers, and we spent a lot of time setting up, preparing to do the work. We developed a mission statement and values and planning around how we were trying to make this safe enough for people. And we, under Kerry's guidance, we followed a co-sensing process, which is a bit too detailed to get into now, but really trying to make sense together of the literature. We created a bit of a structure that would let us explore what structural oppression is like for families and the impacts and how families and children can survive. And from a thematic analysis of all of those discussions, our resource themes and topics began to emerge. And that's when we were lucky enough to connect in with Zan. So there was a bit of an informal interview process with our lived experience co-designers and mentors, meeting Zan and making sure that that their values and ways of working aligned with the project. And then we formally onboarded Zan and started to work together. And we, under Zan's guidance, created a resource development process adapted from collective narrative practice. We managed to come up with a few different ways of hearing children's voices, direct and indirect ways, so that we could try and make children visible in these resources. And naturally, you know, once you develop your content, there was quite a significant review process, both lived experience practitioner, internal and external to Emerging Minds. And importantly, all the people whose lived experience appear in these resources were asked to review it. Some people, it was meeting online and talking through it if the resource was too tricky for them to read themselves. But it was really important that people got to check how they were portrayed in these resources, and that the quote was correct, and that they didn't want to change, or maybe they did want to change how they'd said something. I think if I was to say overall, you know, overall the summary of this process, I think I would say that it really mattered that this work was relational, and it held a commitment to sharing power with and amplifying the voices of children and families who are impacted by structural oppression. So that's a little bit about the process. I thought it would be really interesting now to hear from Zan. Zan, could you step us through some of the intentions of the resources that we created together?
For sure. There's a lot that we could say about this. I guess, you know, hearing from Kerry at the beginning, it speaks to the fact that, you know, our framework is what is going to make the most difference for families who are up against it. Well, you know, money, housing, structural change, these kinds of things, addressing racism. Emerging Minds, I don't work for Emerging Minds, so I was a consultant, but Emerging Minds is not a direct service provider, so that's outside the scope of what is possible within this project. But nonetheless, we still had some pretty ambitious hopes and intentions, which were to walk alongside families who are going through incredibly tough times of all different kinds, sometimes many at the same time, and trying to provide some relief, however small, from the kind of isolation, shame and blame and stigma, all of which Kerry spoke to, that often come along with tough times and just make them so much harder to survive. So part of this was about sparking memories of or new ideas for ways of getting through and for holding on to what's important to families, and always with this trying to keep the focus on kids and impacts on kids and children's contributions to their families and how they are, you know, active participants in survival. One of the, I guess, things that I always like to mention when you look at the, hopefully you've had a chance to have a squiz at the resources on the website, and the names of the resources I think kind of are a bit misleadingly generic. They make it sound like they're guides, which is not really accurate. We wanted them to be accessible, but ultimately they are invitations, not advice, and we always try to centre diversity and emphasise the way that history and culture and social location shape our experience of the problems and what's possible in responding. So we try to make that visible wherever possible, because as Lydia said, the scope of whose voices were directly included in this project was always going to be limited. So some of the kind of principles that underlie this project, which, you know, pre-existed me, but also are aligned with principles of narrative practice, one of which is the family is not the problem. So, you know, as Kerry described, not seeing us as a walking deficit. I think that's a really great way of wording it. The problems are gendered violence. The problems are, you know, no lack of access to safe childcare and housing and all of these things. These are the problems. Children are not the problems. Parents and carers are not the problems, and the families or even communities are not the problem. So what an important principle is locating the problems in, separating them from people and locating them in a relational context. The other part of that is that it creates room for agency in relation to the problems that we're up against. If the problem is inside of you, it is a lot harder to address than if you can see that it's located in context. And it's not your fault. It stops pitting family members against each other. And yeah, I guess part of how we portrayed that in the resources as well is making sure to really, as possible, richly describe the problems that families are facing. You know, they're probably still a tad too long from an accessibility perspective, but it was so important to be painting a stark picture about what it's like to be parenting in poverty, or while homeless, or while poor and facing racism, because that is the backdrop for understanding the kinds of responses that families have to survive, care for each other. That context is so important. Like, those two stories alongside of each other of oppression and of resistance. And our hope is that families reading this, seeing other family stories and, you know, what they're up against rendered more visible, might help reduce those feelings of blame, responsibility or failure that are so prolific. And that dovetails into that another principle, which again, Kerry has already referred to as well, which is that families are already responding. Children are always responding. That is a baseline assumption of all of these resources. Every person has skills and knowledges that they are using every day to negotiate the things that they're facing and to hold on to their values. And what we also believe is that when those skills and knowledges are made less visible, they become less available. So when that happens, we can become more vulnerable to other people's ideas about what we should be doing, especially practitioners in welfare services or counsellors or whoever we might be, that can be kind of considered the experts on our lives rather than you know, whether or not those solutions are relevant to our context or possible. And that, of course, contributes to this sense of responsibility and blame. So the resources really hope to, in some small way, contribute to relocating expertise back within families and within communities to spark possibilities for the reclamation of agency. Because, you know, again, referring back to what Kerry said again, like, however small a spark of agency is, it can be so significantly influential in the face of, you know, crushingly intractable problems like poverty. It really does matter, and when that is taken away, it is incredibly harmful, dangerous, and violent. So a third kind of hope or intention of this project, a primary reader, like we always imagine for most of the resources, are families, and like realistically probably older young people, parents and carers, but hopefully there are ways in which children, these stories can be shared with children as well. But an adjunct reader are helping professionals. And again, I think it's already clear from, you know, what we've shared so far that the reality is those of us in this work have a huge capacity to become agents of oppression and to compound harm. It's when we slip into believing that problems lie within families, or that there are easy fixes. A dominant cultural response to families struggling with disconnection is often to ask, well, what are they doing wrong? What should they be doing better? What are these relationships, functional or dysfunctional, healthy, unhealthy, right, wrong? Some of these words may be familiar to you in your various fields of practice. Aside from contributing to blame and stigma, those kinds of questions obscure a multitude of normative assumptions about how families, parents, and kids should look, behave, and live. And those normative assumptions are inevitably privileging the ways of living of straight, white, rich, heterosexual, able-bodied, etc., you know, families that are not relevant to all families. And there's value in all different ways of being. So hopefully through amplifying the voices of lived experience, we hope that practitioners, no matter your experience level, are invited into new knowledges of tough times. I've been privileged enough to work in community services most of my adult life, and there were so many moments of deeper understanding and challenged assumptions that I had from participating in this process. So I feel really confident that any practitioner could read these resources and be challenged in ways that are immensely important for the work of standing alongside families who are up against it.
Thank you so much, Zan. I love the way that you use words to describe all of these concepts and understandings. It's really wonderful and talented. Emmy, I'm going to throw to you now. Would you be able to talk a bit about what it was like being involved in creating these resources as a co-designer? What was the process like for you?
Yeah, look, I found the process just really fantastic. It's very new for me because we really we came in with a very open-ended mindset. So we knew what we wanted to do, which is to create these resources. But we didn't quite know how we were going to get there. So that meant that we evolved the whole process as we went along. And I think having that really open mindset was really helpful in allowing us, you know, the group that I was with, you know, all of us co-designers, to evolve in our understanding as well as the resources took shape. So we took shape as the resources took shape in a way. And so it was a very much learning process, and it's already been talked about, this idea of externalizing some of the things that we were experiencing or had experienced. So, you know, for myself, I'd experienced raising my children in poverty. I'd experienced homelessness, violence, discrimination, all that stuff. And so it was really that process of creating the resources also was mirrored in ourselves with this externalizing of these issues that we'd kind of had gone through. So, you know, this, as we started to unpick what it meant, you know, what this idea of structural oppression meant, in terms of our own experiences, I started to see, and I'm sure the other people would have done as well, started to see that we actually, you know, we weren't to blame for what happened. This was a societal problem, and we kind of really started to understand this quite clearly. And yeah, that was a great process to be able to do that, to be able to externalize these issues, and to take these kind of feelings of failure and you know, of inadequacy out of ourselves, or out of myself, and to really put it where it was, which was the societal failure. You know, we were just doing what we had to do, and society wasn't kind of picking up the slack.
Thank you, Emmy. Can you describe some of the impacts for you and your children for being involved? You've already just described one of the impacts there, but were there any others that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, very much. Like so many impacts, it's really hard to kind of narrow it down into a few sentences. But the impact was just overall amazing. I grew in confidence. I suppose, like when I started doing the resources, you know, if I'd thought about what we'd been through, I would just say, yeah, we went through some really tough times and came out the other end. You know, that's the kind of the short and narrow of it. But there was so much in that. So doing the resources meant that I was able to look back at actually what I'd done, what I'd done, and what the children and I had kind of, the skills that we brought to the things that we've been going through, and really kind of interrogate it and unpick our history. Some of it was quite challenging, but even so, we still kind of stuck with it. And so instead of kind of just saying, yeah, you know, it was hard, but we got through, I was able to see exactly how we did that. You know, what skills I actually drew upon to get ourselves out of this situation, what skills my children brought to what was going on to get ourselves out of this situation. It wasn't just a matter of somehow we did it. We could actually name how we did it and see how we did it, you know, and see that even the times when I felt, you know, I was really failing, you know, like when we're homeless and living in a tent and, you know, the kids are really suffering, I could see them, you know, being damaged by what was going on. I could see it in their behaviour, that even in those times when I felt like a complete mess and a complete failure, actually, no, we were actually doing things to help ourselves. And even the kids, you know, one stage that I was throwing rocks at each other was just awful, you know, setting up the tent and they're throwing rocks, and I'm thinking, how much worse can this get? Even in those moments, the kids were doing what they needed to do. You know, obviously throwing rocks isn't great, but part of that is, you know, they were kind of navigating this terrible situation they were in, which was they don't have a home, they don't have a school, you know, they're not doing what kids are meant to do, which is have fun and, you know, come home to a table full of food and all that kind of stuff. They weren't doing that. And so, you know, we were all kind of bringing to each moment what we needed to do to survive. And it worked because we survived.
Thank you for sharing those examples, Emmy. That's really powerful examples. And I think one of my fears for this project is that we would do more harm by making visible all of this structural oppression that families were facing and then not really have anything to offer. And I think what you've started to describe there is the way that these resources can help people recognise their skills and know-how that they're using, that they have, that are in them. What impact do you hope these resources will have for other families and children?
Yeah, so I think first of all, like you said, we're naming what's going on. And so, you know, when I was going through some really tough things, I felt like there was no one else going through this stuff. And there was really no help for me. You know, we were just kind of like thrashing through the bush trying to find our own path kind of thing. So what these resources do in the first instance is show other families going through really hard times that they're not alone, that they're not the first people to go through that. And so, you know, that alone is really helpful, you know, where you can see your story represented in another person. And so there's that aspect. But also, I think we're able to give a sense of hope because, you know, I did these resources from a retrospective perspective in the sense that I was looking back and unpicking what happened and then talking about what happened. And I was able to do that with a retrospective lens because I'm now housed and, you know, my children are older and they're, you know, our life is really good. You know, our life is how we want it. It took us a while to get there, but we got there. And so I think it's really important, you know, from this authentic lived experience perspective of people who have gone through this stuff to be able to say, yeah, I was able to come to you know, this is what I did and this is how I got there. Everyone's way of doing it is different, but you will find a way. And you can find a way, and kind of don't give up hope. So, I mean, I don't want to give anyone advice because, you know, what advice can you give? It's really about kind of saying, I hear you, and there is hope.
Wise words, Emmy. Thank you so much. Kerry, how do you think you would have received these kinds of resources if they were offered to you when your family was living in poverty and other forms of distress?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Emmy. When I was thinking about this question, part of me was like, well, you know, when your needs are so desperate and all you have is a resource that's a bit of information, it's kind of like I don't know. But I think for me, what I would have seen and heard is partly myself reflected in it. There's nothing out there that speaks to me ever. And in that as well, I think hopefully some validation. So my experience was being an invalid mother all the time, every day, whether it's the car you drive, whether it's the state of your house, whether it's because you get your children to school late and not maybe in quite the right uniform or something, you know, something's always a little bit awry. And part of it is inevitable because you are always under-resourced in this world, and part of it is just that's what you internalise. And I remembered once our neighbour, who had been a single mother at one point, just made an off-the-cuff comment to me one day, having kind of been a witness to some of our experiences, just made a remark about, you know, you're amazing or something like that. And it was really the only time I'd ever had a single word about you're incredible, you are amazing. I'd never heard it from myself really, and I'd not heard it from any other part of my social environment. And so I think maybe a resource like this might have A, resonated with me, and B, maybe provided me with a little bit of validation about the reality of the challenges that we're under. Challenges is another sanitised word, but just recognition of our experiences and potentially some hope. Yeah.
Thank you, Kerry. Yeah, really important to name the limitations of any written resource when families are facing structural oppression. Zan, could you please talk a bit about the practitioner guides that we developed that sit alongside these resources?
Yeah, so I'm realizing that, you know, before when I was speaking about the ways in which, you know, folks in work like mine can be agents of oppression, I didn't explicitly name the ways in which we can also be accomplices in resistance. And, you know, realistically, we're probably often doing both at the same time. But these guides are an invitation, and, you know, I'm guessing most of you are here in this webinar because you are also committed to being accomplices in resistance and do all sorts of things in your own practice. But we also wanted to make sure that we had a resource for practitioners to take up these all of the whole package of resources in a way that's in line with the intentions of the project. So they include some of the background theory or evidence and relevant, well, evidence relevant to the themes and the frameworks of the project. They have two sets of questions. So one set of questions are sort of suggested questions that the practitioner could ask families that they work with after kind of maybe reading a resource together or after sharing it. And we really explicitly recommend that those are adapted to the cultural context that you're working with, you know, the age of the folks that you're working with, you know, the people better than we would. So they're kind of just starting places for exploring resonance and also what felt divergence, I suppose, like what was about those stories that they read that didn't feel relevant to their experience, or how is their experience different? What was it? Did it spark memories of the family's own responses to tough times? And also kind of getting into conversations about their hard-won knowledges that could be shared. And finally, thinking about impact. So what difference has reading this resource made for them? I guess one of the intentions of the guide as well is to influence the way that we practitioners are listening to the stories that families tell us, so to train our ears to always be paying attention to and curious about stories of suffering or injustice or oppression, as well as stories of response and resistance, so that we're always thinking about both of those things at the same time. And we offer up a few different reflection questions for practitioners to examine our own practice. So having a think about who are the families that we support and what do we know and what might we not know about what they're up against. How were we impacted by the resources? How might they shape our practice? Were any of our ideas or assumptions challenged by reading the resources? By the way, we'd love to hear back from you about that. Feel free to send emails to Emerging Minds about the impacts these have. Also thinking a bit beyond kind of those face-to-face conversations, if that's the nature of your work. I'm guessing there's folks here from lots of different roles, but I'm thinking about what structural barriers might exist within the services that we are working in, and what might we do to reduce them? Do we provide, you know, bus tickets or taxi fares, or do we know like rigorously about all of the food services in our community, et cetera, et cetera? What's going to make it possible for people to access our services? And also, what are our responsibilities beyond our workplace to actually address the inequities that face so many families and kids? As Vicky Reynolds says, you know, so we're not just bandaging people up and sending them back out into the world that hurt them. So yeah, offerings about, you know, all sorts of places that could take you, and, you know, ideas, you know, how you might share the resources as well in your work context.
Awesome, thank you, Zan, for that description. How else do you think practitioners could leverage off of the ideas in these resources?
Yeah, so I guess, you know, just continuing that thought, like, might you be taking them up for the purposes of training? Like there's, you know, I guess there can be something problematic about quote unquote case reviews, but there are a multitude of stories that have been generously offered up in these resources that you could have all sorts of rigorous conversations about in thinking about your work and practice. Perhaps there are places in your community where you know it would be really beneficial to have printouts of these resources, hospital or GP waiting rooms, schools, childcares, I don't know, whatever, community centres. So, you know, please do print them out, take them over there, that'd be awesome. We would have really loved for these to be living documents so that the folks who read them could respond and add to them, which wasn't tech possible at the present time. So we were hoping that practitioners might play a role in continuing the ripples of collective lived experience knowledge sharing. And maybe there are ways that you could find for families that you work with to share their skills and knowledges. Yeah, and I guess also, like, you know, the reality is, as much as we, you know, not me personally, but, you know, worked hard on the SEO and the accessibility of these on the web, there are going to be so many folks, especially who are in the thick of crisis, who are not going to find their way to these resources. So perhaps you can be the link. Yeah, so those are a few different ideas.
Thanks, Anne. And what about what kind of language would you use if you wanted to invite families to make their own contributions to these resources?
So this is a real speedy overview of like ideas that really come from collective narrative practice, which I can't do justice in the time today. I do recommend checking out the work of David Denborough on the Dulwich Centre website if you want to learn more about that. But a principle of narrative practice is having people speak through us, not to us. And one of the simplest ways to start is by sharing the tips that folks share with you or the stories with other families you support. So, you know, meeting a family, you could say something like, oh, I really reckon that there might be other families who would really appreciate hearing that idea about how you managed to keep yourself and your kids safe when you were homeless. Would you mind me sharing that if I think they might find it useful? So, you know, even then, whether or not you even do have that opportunity to share, that in and of itself can be a really honouring response to what's been shared with you. I would suggest, though, that, you know, wherever possible, try to use the exact words of families. If you're taking notes, that's great. And really resist the urge to paraphrase or interpret, even and especially from children's advice or stories. There's a couple of really good courses on the Emerging Minds website, which are included in your extra links: Engaging Children, Shrinking Problems, and Engaging Children, Rich Pictures, which provide all sorts of skills for how to have conversations with kids that uplift their knowledges and skills and perspectives on the problems they're facing. So check those out if you want to. And yeah, I guess if you do have an opportunity to share that story with another family, and there's a possibility to, you know, hear from them about the impact it's had, take notes on that, share it back with the first family, let them know that they have had an impact on someone else. You could do this in a, you know, creative way. A colleague of mine who's actually in those training videos, Carolyn Markey, used to work in a primary school, and she had a big tree up on the wall where, you know, kids and parents and carers who would come in and work with her might stick up pictures or words or small stories on that tree, and others who came in could have a look and just see what resonated. So you might be able to do something similar where you start collecting more stories on a theme that's resonant for like lots of folks that you work with. Perhaps one of our resources, is really pertinent to the families that you see in your context, or, you know, perhaps you're sparked to think about collecting stories around another theme from the way that we've done these resources. It could be as simple as a word on a post-it note, or inviting families to draw or write something themselves, just kind of always honouring families' own authorship and how they might want to be named or located or anonymous in those offerings of wisdom. And I guess one final suggestion I might offer up is that if you're speaking with folks who have a lot to share, you might want to have conversations about avenues for lived experience work. Perhaps, you know, maybe not even in the formal way. Maybe it's just in parent groups that they're a part of, or as part of their school community, or, you know, contacting an MP. But if you did want to have conversations with them about lived experience work and them sharing their knowledges and skills, we actually also have a guide, again, links provided, called Tips for Getting Involved in Lived Experience Work, which has a lot of hard-won knowledge in that as well. So that could be something that you offer up as a way of really uplifting folks' sharing of their skills and knowledges.
So many awesome suggestions in there. Thank you, Zan. Emmy, what do you think about those ideas of, you know, practitioners seeking contributions? How do you think you and your family might have liked to have been asked when you were really in the thick of it to contribute your wisdom to other families?
Yeah, I think just like an invitation that's already been said, you know, like kind of no one wants to like hear you should or you could, those kind of odd words. They should be banned from the language in general. But yeah, like an invitation or you know, at the right time. I mean, sometimes I wouldn't have had any space to hear anything apart from help, you know, what do I do? But just kind of finding a way to let that family know that they're not alone, and that, you know, without invalidating what they're going through, And you want to be careful that you don't say, well, you know, this family's done this, so in a way that kind of invalidates the right pain. But as a way of kind of just saying, you know, you're not alone, and other other families have gone through what you've gone through, and you know, have what am I trying to say, that like, it's not like giving advice, but it's just kind of like validating your experiences, I guess. Essentially, that's what it is. You know, that other families have gone through what you've gone through, and there is a solution, there is a way out. And you know, something that the resources show, I think, is that, you know, it's very individual how you find your path. And, you know, each of us did it in our own way. And that comes out in the resources, that even though our experiences might have been similar in the sense that they're all based around these social determinants that are all around social injustice, that the way we experienced it and the way we found our way out of it was very individual and unique. And so, you know, having that invitation to have a look at what other families have done, and then to be able to say, well, maybe you can find your own way out as well, whatever that pathway is. That would have been really, really wonderful.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thanks so much, Emmy. So we've had some questions come through from the audience before the webinar, so thank you to everyone who sent those through, and we'll get to some of them shortly. But I wanted to let you know that the panelists will be taking some extra time offline after the webinar today to answer some extra questions, and that this extended webinar will be recorded and will be available along with the recording of the live webinar within 2 weeks. So first, another question for Zan, and this is, could you please explain how what we're talking about here is different to strengths-based practice?
Sure. I mean, I'm sure Kerry and Emmy could speak to this too, but I guess when I think about strength, I'm thinking about who is it that's defining what is a strength, and often really normative ideas can sneak in around that. I'm obviously talking from a practitioner perspective, so I don't think that my account of, or my ideas about what is a strength are actually relevant. I think that, you know, if folks are identifying strengths in their own experience, that can be really meaningful, but it's not actually for me to define what those are, because, you know, there's also a really strong cultural trend towards, you know, what can sometimes be described as weaponized positivity, and I think that that can be really hazardous in the space of working with families who are up against it. You know, resilience is a useful concept in a lot of different circumstances, but for me to define someone as being resilient is very totalizing. It can be obscuring, like the hardness, the suffering, the feeling like the battle on a day-to-day basis to get through, or to believe that you're a worthwhile person or parent. And I think that can often do more harm than good. So really, yeah, I guess another point being that when we talk about strengths in ways that are like internal to a person, that can set people up to fail a little bit if the context changes, where that, you know, whatever it might be, courage or kindness or whatever, becomes less available. And perhaps like they're, you know, they might see that there's strength in other things like fear or anger or whatever. So I guess just like I'm always very trying to pay attention to my own assumptions about what other people's strengths are, and being very careful not to define people by those. And instead, I think there's a lot of other stuff that we can explore that is richer, which is like, what do people know and what do people care about? And yes, we're not all going to act in line with our ethics all of the time, especially when you're up against it. Often you're hugely separated from those. It doesn't mean that we're not still in connection with them and finding our way back to them and finding small ways to, you know, live in line with them. And, you know, we can move closer and further away from what we know, what we're skilled at. We can remember things that once we knew before but have forgotten. So I guess personally, I think that there's a lot of value in privileging kind of fluidity and untangling ourselves from normative kind of universalizing frameworks of strengths and weaknesses.
Thank you, Zan. Kerry, this was a question that came through from before the webinar. Could you explain how experiencing social inequality is bidirectional with mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much literature on this now. And I mean, really, who would have thought that, you know, threatening, terrifying, unsafe circumstances would make you feel a little anxious or depressed. Interestingly, there was a report out from the United Nations just a couple of months ago talking about poverty and human rights and the impact of poverty on mental ill health, and it's something like 3 times the experiences of what we call anxiety and depression if you're on a lower income. And so I have questions about the morality and the political nature of what we call the mental health system in actually masking the context derived circumstances of what we call mental ill health. And so, you know, we so know through a lived experience lens, but obviously now through so much research that the social determinants cause what we call mental ill health. We also know when you're paralysed by exhaustion and fear and disassociation and associated experiences of distress, that your functioning is not going to be optimal. And so it can become a circular rippling effect, both for individuals, but also intergenerationally as well. So, for example, I remember one of our children being paralysed by fear that they had a genetic disorder that was going to be passed down to them. And the lack of resources to be able to deal with any of these kinds of uncertainties or anxieties, again, just compound it. And so when you're living in unsettled, threatening, unsafe environments, it's difficult to study, it's difficult to work. And so, of course, we're setting people up intergenerationally as well. So it's such a huge, huge reform of the mental health system that's required, including the way that we conceptualise it, which then, of course, conceptualises how we respond to people's needs as well.
Thank you, Kerry. You did a smashing job describing that in such a short amount of time. Thank you. We had another question come through on talking to kids about homelessness. So we'd just like to point people to the resource Talking to Children About Homelessness, which hopefully someone will pop in the chat there for you. And within that resource, there's a podcast called Talking to Your Children About Experiencing Family Homelessness that contains some great tips about that. We also had a lot of questions about practical supports come through. So we just wanted to flag that as a national org in these resources, it wasn't possible to name all of the appropriate local supports, but where possible, we did link to the resources that we could, but you know, they're not going to be relevant locally to everyone. But perhaps we could end with you, Emmy, on a final word of caution for practitioners taking care when supporting families to manage finances or budget, for example.
Yeah, before you give tips on budgeting, find out if there's actually any money to budget. Because if you like don't have any money, like you get paid on one day and an hour into that day your money is all gone, which is what happened to me most of the time when I was living in poverty. There's literally no money to budget, and being told, you know, hey, have you tried doing this to budget, or why don't you set up a second bank account for your bills, or why don't you just put $5 aside every week, and then before you know it, you've got all this money. It's not going to work. So yeah, and that's actually really insulting hearing that. So do some exploring first with that family.
Thank you, Emmy. really great advice. Look, we could keep going for much longer, and we will in the extended Q&A, but for now, we've reached the end of the webinar. So a huge thank you to you three, and for audience, everyone joining us. Thank you. All the people behind the scenes, aifs, and the people who made the closed captions possible today. Don't forget to subscribe to the aifs and Emerging Minds newsletters to be notified about the recording. And remember the feedback survey in the chat. And we look forward to joining you at the next webinar, How to Build a Culturally Safe Workplace with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Staff, which is broadcasting in a couple of weeks' time on 27th of November. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the extended Q&A. Emmy, one of the questions we didn't get to in the live webinar is, would you mind sharing how your experience of social inequalities and injustice changed as your kids grew from early childhood to older?
Yeah, I guess, well, their needs changed, and my needs as a parent changed. So when they were small, it was things like, you know, getting them to appointments, putting petrol in their car to get there, getting appropriate food for them for their nutrition level, how to get to the food places, because we did a lot of food services. What do you do when you've got to go somewhere like Centrelink with your young children and you have to wait for hours? How do you keep them occupied? As they got older, it's things like, you know, how do you explain to them, you know, maybe that they can't join soccer because, you know, you don't have the money to pay for it, or yes, you have to go to this school even though, you know, you're homeless and we might be gone in 3 weeks' time, because if you don't go there, you're going to get a report by, you know, docs for not sending kids to school. So I guess they become more aware of what's going on as they get older. And they want more, you know, as my children got again into the teenage years, they wanted, you know, nice shoes, and, you know, they didn't want to go to the op shop to get their clothes, just things like that, you know, that their experience of it changes. And their awareness of it becomes more pertinent, but also that means you can have more complex conversations about it as well. So my children now, through our experiences, are also very socially minded, and they're aware of social justice.
Yeah, great descriptions, and really important to think about children across developmental ages and stages. Thanks, Emmy. So this next question is from a hospital social worker. We often feel limited by funding and structural barriers or inequalities in how we can support families. How do we sit with not fixing it, or how is our not being able to fix it experienced by families? And we thought this would be a nice question for everyone to answer, to get 3 different perspectives. So Emmy, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I also work as a peer worker now. So I kind of sometimes I experience that from the other side, you know, which is an interesting kind of an interesting way to kind of to experience it from both ends. I guess I think it's important to, you know, to name that you can't fix it. Like when I was seeking help, there was nothing worse than kind of than people kind of like not being honest about it. I guess, you know, you can't fix things sometimes, you know, when we were homeless, no one was going to change that. And some of the best interactions we have with services were the services who were quite blatant about it. I mean, at one stage we're seeing a homeless service, and they basically said, well, we can't help you until this point in time. And we just knew how that was. And so it was like, okay, well, what do we do until that point? So yeah, just be honest about it, because you can't fix some things, but you know, families generally have their way of coping. So just trust that the family will do what they need to do.
Thanks, Emmy. Kerry, what were your reflections on that question?
It's such a good question. I'm conscious of the trauma, the horrible feelings workers can have being stuck in these impossible situations. And I guess at least not shutting off compassion and noticing your own responses so that at least it's not turned into some kind of frustration or twisting it around to blame families because of the frustrations. Going the extra yard when you can, just never giving up. And, like I think one of the world's leading mental health recovery researchers, she says really we should probably not have a mental health system. We should all be social agents of change. And so at what point can you not, be an activist? I just don't remember any practitioners advocating for JobKeeper supports for people on the care or disability pension, for example. They were the one group that missed out. So whenever you can, be an ally, be a compassionate ally, but actually, do stuff in your own life as well. There's nothing to stop you from being an activist outside of work as well as in the moment with families. Yeah.
Great idea, sir. Thank you, Kerry. And Zan?
I mean, Kerry and Emmy have really, I think, nailed the response to this question. I suppose, speaking from my own experience, I have a lot of compassion for, people come into this work because they really do care a lot. I was going to swear. But yeah, that's why we do the work. And it's, as Kerry said, really crushing to be stuck within intractable systems of oppression. Like, it's unavoidable. Even if you're working in private practice, wherever you are, it's more blatant if you're in institutions, for sure. And when you are, in a hospital setting, coming into contact with folks at acute points of crisis, that is really hard to deal with. And I guess aside from, as Amy said, the absolute importance of transparency, of like trusting in people's abilities to survive, and yeah, everything that you guys have already said, I guess it is really important to wrangle with those feelings that you have and think critically about where they come from. I know that for me, as a white person, they have a long history in white saviordom as well, which actually comes from a place of supremacy. And so trying to find ways of like being compassionate with that experience, and also being very critical and careful about the ways that that can become oppression when we try to save people. And we can squash survival skills and strategies that are like already so essential. Obviously, we might have supervision, professional networks like peers to turn to really do that hard work and sit with those feelings. And as Kerry said, like, be an activist. Like, if the system's oppressive and unfair in your workplace, like, how can we change that? How can we work around it? Like, obviously there are all sorts of people, and we have a really great resource about stories of collaboration, care, and solidarity between families and practitioners, where practitioners are being, creative and rebels in their workplaces in order to go above and beyond and be accomplices to people in whatever way they possibly can, inside and outside the workplace. So yeah, doing all of that, sitting with your feelings about it, and doing the work around that, as Kerry said, so they don't end up becoming compounding harm for those that you work with.
I might just jump in and out as well, if that's okay. Sometimes, when you can't fix things, which is quite often the case in these really acute situations, it's really helpful as well to help the person that you're working with to name what they're bringing to the issue already. What skills they're using already to get through whatever it is they're going through, and what skills they're going to be using down the track. And also to just kind of help them to make meaning of what's going on, because sometimes you know, all you've got left is the meaning of something, you know, how you kind of frame it and how you make sense of it. So help them to make sense of it, you know, in a way that's affirming of them and their skills, and as non-blaming. So if you sense that there's any blaming or self-blaming going on, really help that person to turn that lens around from inner to outer, you know, so it's about you know, not themselves but about society, and it might seem really pointless at the time, but it's not. It really isn't. Sometimes people just need to be reminded as well. So, you know, fully making sure that person, you know, doesn't start to blame themselves, or because that brings a sense of the loss of hope as well.
Great tips, thank you, Emmy. Well, look, those are all of the questions that we had, but we did have one final question, Emmy. People are keen to see your artwork, if you wouldn't mind showing
Okay.
us to close.
It's unfinished, so I've just been doing this during the webinar. Yeah.
It's incredible.
I'm also
Very
an artist.
Thanks so much, Emmy. All of us can rest easy now, knowing what you were
Yeah,
creating there.
now you know. The cat's out of the bag.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Have a great day.